the series we're in is about bearing hope. And in particular, this Daniel series is about bearing hope in a pagan, hostile world. And the truth is that we're under pressure at the moment in our world. I don't know whether you've noticed or not, but there is pressure to compromise. Everywhere we look as Christians, there's pressure to compromise. If you're following the American scene, I don't know why anyone would follow the American scene, but if you're watching this drama playing out between Trump and Clinton, you're thinking to vote for either of those two people is having to compromise. Really? I feel for our Christian brothers and sisters in America. I mean, it's a kind of persecution to have to vote for Trump, isn't it? Or a persecution to have to vote for Hillary. Like, really, you look at them both and go, how can we do this? You know, it's just really sad. And the Australian scene isn't actually all that much better, really. If you look at it, our politics is very much tarnished by having to compromise. Who can we vote for? That's just in the political field. But it's not just the political field, is it? You know, the same-sex marriage debate is rising, and then disappearing, and then rising again. And Christians are feeling under a great deal of pressure to compromise. And I think that some people are thinking if we just keep spinning it out, they'll just give in. You know, I think that seems to be one of the arguments that's placed for these kinds of things in the world today. If we just keep pushing it, people will just give in. Family pressures. Family pressures are rising. The rate of change in the world. I was talking to my son the other day about using paper and pencil. You know, when your technology fails, you can use paper and pencil. And I was told, you're so out of date, Dad, you know. It's like, you know, as if anyone would do that. Paper and pencil, well done. You know, the rate of change. You know, we've got heroes falling. You know, how many rugby league heroes have we seen come crashing down through drug scandals, through abuse scandals, through violence? Our heroes come crashing down. And I think it's just all gelling together into a cocktail of compromise in our world. And as Christians, we're under pressure. We're under pressure to compromise. And the scripture that we're going to look at this evening from Daniel, I think will challenge us to think about this. It's better to trust than tumble when facing compromise. I was trying to find some words that started with the same letter. I had some others too, but trust and tumble is where I ended up. Better to trust than tumble when facing compromise. That's where we're going this evening. You might have heard of this guy, Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell was a famous sprinter, and he was pretty much guaranteed to win the 100 metres in the 1927, I think it was, Olympics, and he was representing Scotland, and he was pretty much guaranteed to win. When he was getting onto the boat to sail off, he found out that the race, the heat for the race, was going to be on a Sunday. And Eric Liddell said in his heart, look, I've already purposed in my heart, Sunday is the Lord's day. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to run on the Lord's day. Now, some of us would go, that's nothing. What difference does it make? But in Eric Liddell's heart, he had a conviction that said, it's a day that's set aside for the Lord, and I'm not going to run. So the story continues. He got over there, and the Olympic Committee tried to sway him and twist his arm. You know, they tried to encourage him strongly. His own countrymen started to abuse him and insult him, you know, for not, you know, stepping up for his country and running and in this race that he was guaranteed to win. He said, no, I'm not going to do it. And so he didn't. He stuck to his guns and didn't race in that 100 metres. And a couple of days later was the 400 metres, which he had never prepared for really, and certainly was not his strength. But he said, well, I'll run in the 400 metres. And so he showed up, and he was unexpected. You know, no one expected him to win. They just thought, 400 metres, no 400 metre runner runs 100 metres, no 100 metre runs 400 metres. It's just like chalk and cheese. They're just such different skills. No one expected him to be successful. And Eric, when he told the story, he said that it was as if the Lord carried him on. He ran that 400 metres, and he ran like the wind. He was a good 5 metres ahead of the next runner in that 400 metres, and he went on to win gold. Now, usually you might be, I don't know, a hundredth of a second, maybe even a quarter of a second behind the person behind you. But to have won the 400 metres with a 5 metre gap between him and the next runner is almost unheard of at that high level of sport. And so Eric said that God honoured his choice not to compromise. And he then went home to Scotland, and a real doorway opened across his own country for the gospel. Because what happened was all these working factories would all ask Eric to come and speak to their staff in their lunch break or in their staff meetings or whatever, just to inspire them and encourage them. And so Eric would go and preach the gospel. An opportunity that never would have arisen had he not honoured the Lord and held to his convictions under pressure. And the Lord opened a door so that his faithfulness provided opportunity for him to bear hope to a world that surrounded him. We're going to have a look at this passage from Daniel 3. But as we do, I just want to kind of say, we're going to get into this story about Nebuchadnezzar and his giant statue of gold. And it's going to be a challenging story because we don't have anything like this kind of thing happen in our culture here in Australia. We don't have statues and idols as a commonplace in our culture at all. But I've just been in India. And something struck me in a way that doesn't here in Australia about the reality of the passage that we're going to look at tonight. So I just thought I'd give you a few highlights from India. So India has lots of cars. So what they do in India is they use whatever they have available to transport themselves around, and that could be cars, it could be bikes, it could be motorcycles, it could be oxen and cart. And typically they're all the same in the main highway. They're all, travelling on the same highway at the same time. And there's 3 lanes, but they're just suggestive. Because 3 lanes actually means 7 or 8 lanes. And the signs that say one way, I think they must be suggestive as well. Because you can be travelling down a one-way street and have 3 or 4 cars coming at you at 60 kilometres an hour, and somehow they don't have any accidents. But I just thought I'd share a couple of photos. These are actual photos that I took in India, so I've seen all these things. There's a lot of people in India, and they all like to pile in on one another in the vehicles that they use. Up the top there you'll see a family of 5 on a motorcycle. That's common. I did see a motorcycle with a goat. The people who were from India that I was driving with said, "You don't see that every day." So, for them to be surprised, it was a bit unusual. I just didn't get the camera out fast enough to take a photo of the people carrying the goat. But, yeah. Anyway, one of the interesting cultural things that they do in India, and this is part of this kind of worship that they have over there. India, the land of 1,000 gods, more than 1,000 gods. Actually, pretty much anything can be a god in India. One of the things they do, they have festivals all year round, and so what they do is they mix cow dung with chemical, some kind of chemical. And because a cow is a holy creature. And so its dung has special spiritual powers. You know what I'm talking about, don't you guys? It's cow dung, right? Yeah. They mix it with a chemical and they paint all of their footpaths and paths in their house, all the exterior paths and driveways and everything in this chemical cow dung. That's their act of worship. It's quite an interesting smell, as you can imagine. And that's a way of them worshipping and honouring their gods. But there are gods everywhere. There are temples everywhere. These are temples that I saw just in the neighbourhood not far from where I was staying. There were 3 temples that I could throw a stone from where I was staying. And in those temples they have their idols. But I just wanted to point out to you, it struck me like never before, what they did with these idols. What they would do is, people would bring sacrifices to these idols. And typically it would be food sacrifices. They would bring all kinds of food, fruit and fresh fruit, milk and honey, special sweet items. And they would mash it all up. And then they would pour it over the top of the idol. And I thought that was interesting. I thought, oh, that's an interesting act of worship. And then I watched what they did as they scooped the food up off the idol and from around the idol and pushed it into the idol's mouth. I saw this happen. And they were feeding their god. They had taken their own act of sacrifice and then they squashed it up and then they pushed it into the mouth of this idol. They are doing this. And then they would take a milky water substance, so they'd mix milk and water together, and they would pour it over the idol to wash all of the food that they just pushed over the idol and wash it off. And they would bathe this idol and cleanse it. And this is common. See, we don't get idol worship in Australia in quite the same way as perhaps they do in India. And it just really made me think of a passage from Psalm 115. Psalm 115, verses 4 to 9 says this. Not to us, Lord. I'll start at verse 1. Not to us, but to your name be the glory, because of your love and faithfulness. Why do the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in heaven. He does whatever he pleases. But their idols are silver and gold, made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak. They have eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel, feet but cannot walk, nor can they utter a sound with their throats. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. We're going to look at Nebuchadnezzar's great image this evening in just a moment. Unlike the people of India, we have set up other kinds of gods, other kinds of places that we put our trust, if you like. What kinds of gods do we have? Well, ours are things like we put our trust in the state, Centrelink, the regular payments. We put our trust in the welfare system. Perhaps we put our trust in insurance and insurance companies. I know some people who put their trust in an insurance company recently and now the insurance company's suing them and not doing what it should in terms of paying out their claim. Some of these places are not good places to put our trust. Do we put our trust in science? Perhaps we put it in progress. You know, the world's getting better, they try and tell us. Put our trust in medical advancement or technology. Maybe you've put your trust in democracy or nationalism. A place that we often put our trust is pleasure. Let's read Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. This is our passage for this evening. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he'd set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of this image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and all the peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The first thing I want to point out to you this evening is that Nebuchadnezzar was no dummy. He had conquered the known world. If you were looking at the idea of King of Kings, we kind of reserve that for God, right? But as far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned, he was King of Kings. He had nations all at his footstool. And he decided that he was going to bind his nation, or his combination of nations, his kingdom, together in unity. And the tool for him to do that was through this golden idol, this statue. Now, it's an interesting thought that last week, I'm sure you would remember, for those who were here, we looked at Daniel 2, and I understand Pastor Matt explained to you the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And in that dream, there was a statue with a head of gold. And it's largely suggested that the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar's head, and indeed, rather than learning the lesson from the statue in the dream that he was supposed to, which was that God was in control and sovereign, and God had a plan for the nations, Nebuchadnezzar took it upon himself to be that statue of gold. And the suggestion is that this idol, this image that Nebuchadnezzar had them all bowing down to, was an image of himself. And so the challenge was to this conquered people, the Israelites who had been carried off into exile, was to compromise. See, in Exodus 20, God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And he also says, "You shall have no graven image." So the first two commandments Nebuchadnezzar is challenging here, and he's challenging it in the most dominant way possible, because what he does is he gets all of the system of government that exists, calls them all together. These people, he says, the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials. So we've got advisors, we've got rulers, we've got treasurers, we've got judges who administer the law, we've got magistrates who are the administrators of the legal system, we've got all of the advisors. It was basically like getting the who's who of everybody and starting with them. And he gets them to bow down. So the question is, are they going to compromise? Are they going to tumble under pressure? Some say all religions are equal. Have you heard that? I'm sure you've heard people say, all religions are equal. They all lead to God. Well, that's only possible if they say all religions are equally true. But what they really mean is all religions are equally untrue. That is, we can deal with them as all the same because they're all equally false, and therefore we just pretend You know, a religion is a kind of pretend thing that you do. Because if all religions were true, they can't possibly be true when they contradict and disagree with one another. If you begin with the basis of a God who is not there, like these false gods of the nations, that's what they made them themselves. Silver and gold and wood. And what does Psalm 115 say? They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have feet but cannot walk. They have hands but cannot feel. They're false, right? If that was true, would it matter whether they compromised and bowed down or not? No, it wouldn't matter. It only matters if there is a God who is there. And so we have these three characters that enter the story. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. And they're going to be challenged. They're challenged because when we see these satraps and advisors and prefects and treasurers and judges and magistrates, guess what? That's like their peers. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego had been carried off and they had been made into an elevated position in the government. And so we see the kind of thing that you and I could say, everybody's doing it. I've heard my kids say that more than once. Everybody else does it, why can't we do it? Everybody's doing it. What's the problem? Today's media bias is built around this. You think about it, what do we hear? There are certain figures that the media will only allow you to hear one side of the story about. Regardless of your stance on them, we've talked about Trump and Clinton, but there's another person in the Australian story that we only really hear one kind of media report on, Pauline Hanson. Regardless of what you think of Pauline Hanson, I'm pretty sure that the attempt is to buffoon her every word. Why? Because we want to create the picture that everybody's against it. No one is for it. The same thing is argued. We talked earlier about the same-sex marriage. The same thing is argued for this. They say, everybody's for it. Nobody's against it. And if you are against it, well, you're a nobody. You know, you don't deserve an opinion. You don't deserve to be heard. Everybody's doing it. It's the accepted view. And you know, under this kind of pressure, some people capitulate. During World War II, Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about the fact that the churches were encouraged to support Hitler. And Hitler used a lot of church kind of language to act as if he was, you know, part of the Christian movement. And Bonhoeffer stood against Hitler's work in Germany, but there were those in the church who didn't. They capitulated. And they went along with it for a period of time. Because when you're under pressure, especially peer pressure, or everybody's doing it, all the leaders are doing it, it can be hard to hold your faith. There was another kind of compromise pressure, the pressure of penalty. In verse 6, we read this: "Whoever does not fall down and worship immediately will be thrown into a blazing furnace." Well, that was a pretty harsh kind of pressure to exert, but there are lots of others across time that have been exerted to try and force people to capitulate, to compromise, persecution. Even in our world today, we see Christians beheaded. We see people having to pay higher forms of tax, where identifying symbols or marks only be allowed to work in certain jobs. The partner passage for our Daniel passage this evening is 1 Peter. And in 1 Peter 1 verse 7 we read this, of this fire, this fiery furnace. He talks about suffering grief in all kinds of trials. And he says, "These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes, even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honour when Jesus Christ is revealed." You know, even when we're facing a penalty of some kind, if we can stand against it. God's word says that it actually does a refining work in us. But they were challenged by penalty. And they were challenged by prestige. As we said, Nebuchadnezzar, he was like a divine human being as far as everyone was concerned. He was God on earth. This was not uncommon. The Roman Caesars were treated like God on earth. The Egyptian pharaohs were treated like God on earth. And so indeed was Nebuchadnezzar. And he was the one who elevated whoever he chose. Last week you saw Daniel. Daniel and his friends were elevated when they were able to interpret a dream that no one else could. And you didn't really want to be on the wrong side of Nebuchadnezzar, but being on his good side was likely to lead to being elevated. And so the pressure of prestige can also be exerted. That issue of prestige, though, is pretty crucial to our story this evening. In verse 8, we read of some people who were robbed of their prestige. And that's why this whole incident happens. In verse 8, at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship this image of gold. And whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews who you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." These guys were called the Chaldeans, or in this passage, the astrologers. But do you know who they were? Last week in Daniel 2, remember Nebuchadnezzar was having a bad dream and he wanted someone to interpret it. And he called all of the astrologers together and said, "You tell me my dream." And they said, "No one can do that, O king." And he was going to have them all killed. And so Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego prayed, and Daniel was given the interpretation, both of the vision of the dream and the interpretation of the dream. But after that happened, Daniel and his friends were elevated. And all of the Chaldeans, all of these astrologers, you know what happened to them? They were the ones who couldn't do it. This prestige drove them and they lost it. And they were out for blood. So they set up this whole episode because they know these three men's character, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're depending on it. They're staking their own lives on it. And it says that they denounced the Jews. Now this word denounced, it doesn't really kind of show us what we're really talking about here. They in one version, the translation was tore strips off them. They demolished them. They spoke as violently and angrily against them as they could. They were out for blood. And they played to the king's pride and arrogance. In verse 10 they say, "Your Majesty is issued, and they pay no attention to your Majesty." And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are in big trouble. We come across now the challenge that they face. What are they going to do? The scripture tells us that Nebuchadnezzar was furious with rage, and he summoned them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then," now listen to this, "what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Listen to the arrogance of that statement. Do you know why? Because Nebuchadnezzar's no dummy. And he knows that an idol is a nothing. He's not used to the idols that these people setting up actually being capable of actually doing anything. And so he's not he's saying, what God will deliver you out of my hand, because he's like, there's no God. All these idols we set up, they're just tools that we use to manipulate people. My image, it's me. I'm trying to draw everyone to me. But listen to what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego say. Verse 16, they replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. He will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you've set up. This is a picture of commitment. They chose to trust instead of tumble when the pressure came. And they make 3 statements. Our God is able. Our God is willing. But even if he doesn't. I just want to deal with them in reverse. I'm going to go backwards through those statements. Verse 16 to 18 again. King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know we will not serve your gods or worship the image you have set up. Even if he doesn't. Verse 16 says, we don't need to defend. When they showed up, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego came with hearts that were already decided. Nebuchadnezzar gave him another chance. He said, well, you didn't do it, but it's okay because you can do it now. And if you do it now, all will be well. And they said, no, we don't need you to do it again. Answer will be the same. The answer will be the same. And even if he doesn't save us, we're not going to bow down to your idol. And you know why? They had predetermined in their heart. They had predetermined in their heart. It wasn't like they were making up, oh, will I, won't I? I'm not sure. Will I, won't I? Now, we have a statement in Queensland when we have floods, there's a predetermined statement that we all use. If it's flooded, forget it. Right? Before we go out on the roads, we already have that predetermined statement in our minds. If it's flooded, forget it. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego and Daniel had all predetermined. We saw it in Daniel 1. What happened? They got brought to Babylon and they were told they were going to eat of all of the food of the kingdom. And they said, no, we've predetermined. We're going to follow God no matter what. We're just going to eat a simple diet. We're not going to get caught up in your Babylonian ways. We predetermined in advance. Regardless of the consequences, no matter what happens to us, we've already worked it out. I think that they saw the big picture. In 1 Peter, again, chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, we read this. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who spoke of the grace that was to come to you searched intently and with the greatest of care, trying to find out the time and circumstances to which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing when he predicted the sufferings of the Messiah and the glories that was followed. Verse 12 says, it was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves alone, but also you, when they spoke of the things that have now been told you by those who preach this gospel to you. Even angels long to look into these things. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego realized that their decision was not just for them alone. Their decision was for all of us. Their decision was for all of their people. Think about it. Every single ruler and leader had been drawn in and was bowing. So Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego's choice not to bow wasn't just about them. It was a symbol of national rebellion. It was a symbol of national identity. They weren't just doing it for them, they were doing it for all of their people. And we can look back across time and see it was for us also. So, will we predetermine in our hearts what our response will be, regardless? They had courage to bear hope. Look at verses 16 to 18 of our passage in Daniel. Verse 16 to 18 shows what happened next. They went into the fiery furnace. Verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was furious, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie them up and throw them into the furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement. He asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They said, "Certainly, Your Majesty." And he said, "Look, 4 men are walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come here." So they came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors all crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent the angel who rescued their servants." They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Their God was willing, and as a result of their willingness, they were able to bear hope to Nebuchadnezzar. And what happened? Nebuchadnezzar was impacted. When he saw their willingness to die for their faith and the rescue of their great God, their courage gave them the opportunity to bear hope. And Nebuchadnezzar was somehow changed. And then finally they had the power to follow through. They were prepared to face the worst. We often want a sign, don't we? A guarantee. Show me it's all going to be okay, God. You know? That's not really faith. That's called insurance. Even though they were powerless, it says that they were thrown into the fire, fully clothed and bound. They couldn't break themselves free. They had no capacity to save themselves. These 3 men showed their faith in the furnace. They also made the statement, "Our God will." Our God will. They weren't just wondering about whether God was going to. They actually believed that he would. And they knew that because in Jeremiah 29, we read that famous passage, "I know the plans I have for you." We like to apply that to all of us. "I know the plans I have to you." But in Jeremiah 29, it begins with the phrase, "To those I carried into exile from Jerusalem. I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, give you hope and a future." They were holding tight to God's promise for them, that he will. And then finally, they were holding to the truth that God can. He is able. He is powerful. He can be trusted. He's a good father. God had rescued them in the past. They were just reflecting on the fact that God had given Daniel the vision of Nebuchadnezzar. They knew that God can. By trusting the promises of God and following through in this circumstance, they testified to rulers, Nebuchadnezzar and others. And Nebuchadnezzar came to know something of the true and living God. Listen to verse 28. Verse 28, this is the man who only a moment earlier had said, "And then what God will be able to save you from my hand?" He says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. For no other God can save in this way." By Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego standing up and holding true in pressure, not tumbling but trusting, they were able to change the attitude of the nation. Nebuchadnezzar goes on to say, anyone who says anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego will be cut into pieces and their houses turned into a pile of rubbish. For no other God can save in this way. God was with them. There was a fourth man like a son of the gods in the fire. God rescued them. He brought them out of the fire. And God blessed them. It says that Nebuchadnezzar promoted Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So the question I have for us all this evening as we just close this and reflect on this, are these outcomes promised to all believers? Not automatically. It's not guaranteed that if we get thrown into a fiery furnace, we'll be retrieved out of it. But what we should remember is this: God can, God will, but even if He doesn't, I will stand firm for who He is. I hope that we can see from this passage tonight that it's better to trust than to tumble when facing compromise. And to make it personal for each of us tonight, maybe you can identify somewhere in your own life where you've been tempted to compromise, or maybe you've actually been compromising. Maybe it's on a little thing, something you think doesn't really matter all that much. I think that we can see from Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego and Eric Liddell and this passage this evening, maybe we need to step up rather than shy away, to trust rather than tumble, to commit rather than compromise. Maybe you need to pre-commit, to say, there are these things out there that could happen. I'm going to decide in advance. No matter what happens, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to bow to those idols. Let's close in prayer. Lord, I thank you for this epic story from the Bible that reminds us of your power in the midst of a challenging circumstance, under pressure. Lord, I pray that as we think about Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and we think about the fiery furnace trial that they went through, Lord, that we might see that we can trust you, knowing that you can, that you will, but even if you don't, we will serve you. We will live for you and we won't compromise. Help us to pre-commit. Whatever it is that we're being challenged or tempted to compromise in, whatever idol it is that's setting itself up against us in our life, Lord, we'll remember those things are dumb nothings. But you are the God who is there. Give us strength in this week. Help us to make a change in this area, that we might stand rather than crumble. In Jesus' name. Amen. The series where